Session 5 of Ecology as Theology, Inspiring Science for Challenging Times. The Prodigal Species Comes Home. So the first two sessions, we focused on Un-trivializing God, that an I-thou relationship to reality is not optional, and the evolutionary purpose of religion and religious necessity of science. The last two sessions, we looked at Big Green History, or the Epic of Evolution, the cosmic 101-year timeline, and then Thus Saith Reality, Evidentially. What's inevitable, what's futile, and why is compassion so important for being pro-future? These next two sessions, we're looking at our unchosen nature and our mortal nature, our mismatched instincts, why we struggle, un-trivializing mythic wisdom, such as the fall and original sin, and impermanence and death as sacred, legacy as the final meaning of life. That's untrivializing or realizing eternal rest. So let's look at human nature, our inescapable mismatched instincts. I did a TEDx talk several years ago, back in 2012. It was my first TEDx talk where I focused on evolutionary psychology and brain science. And I had three evangelicals at the end of my program come up to me independently within about a 2-hour period at the social event that evening. And all three of them said basically the same thing, which was, I was a young earth creationist until I heard your talk. Now I've got to accept evolution. I've just got to do it in a God-honoring way. Like one young man, he was in his mid-20s, I'm guessing, said, I always thought that evolution was about Darwin, DNA, and dinosaurs. I didn't know it was about how to live a more Christ-like life and have healthier relationships. So this is the practical side of an evolutionary worldview. Two of the leading thinkers of the last 50 years are Gregory Bateson and Edward O. Wilson. Bateson writes, the major problems in the world are the result of the difference between the way nature works and the way men think. Now, for quite a few years, I changed that quote to the way people think. But then I realized I think the problem is my half of the species, so I think it's the way men think. So I left the quote the way he wrote it. And then Ed Wilson writes, we exist in a bizarre combination of Stone Age emotions, medieval beliefs, and godlike technology. Now, I mentioned before that Ed Wilson and David Sloan Wilson have worked together on this notion of the evolutionary significance of religion and the religious necessity of science. And David Sloan Wilson has this great quote that sets the context for this discussion of evolutionary psychology and brain science. He says, our unique attributes evolved over a period of roughly 6 million years. They represent modifications of great ape attributes that are roughly 10 million years old, and mammalian attributes that are roughly 245 million years old. We also harbor vertebrate attributes that are roughly 600 million years old, and attributes of nucleated cells that are perhaps 1.5 billion years old. If you think it's unnecessary to go that far back in the tree of life to understand our own attributes, consider the humbling fact that we share with nematode worms the same gene that controls appetite. At most, our unique attributes are like an addition to a vast multi-room mansion. It is sheer hubris to think that we can ignore all but the newest rooms. So why we struggle, suffer, and self-destruct? As I mentioned before, it's not because our great-great-grandmother ate an apple. It's because we have instincts that are mismatched to our current living situation. The first is denial. That is, ever since we've been in the agricultural revolution, the last 10,000 years, many of our instincts no longer serve us, as they do all other animals. I mean, you would not expect a wolf or a bear or an elephant to go counter to their instincts very easily, and yet we have to go counter to our instincts all the time. Otherwise, we cause ourselves and each other problem. And so this notion of denial has been profoundly rooted in our psychology, again, mostly since the agricultural revolution, where we no longer live in sustainable, life-giving, mutually enhancing ways with primary reality. And denial, here's a great definition, the largely unconscious mechanism whereby we refuse to accept the reality of things that are bad or upsetting, or that challenge our worldview, how we live, what is required of us, and or our feelings of superiority. I love these quotes or these cartoons. I've heard of denial, I just don't believe in it. Burying my head in the sand over climate change is much easier now that half the world's turned to desert. It's not denial, I'm just very selective about the reality I accept. And who of us can't relate to this one? My desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. Stephen Jenkinson has a profound quote on why it is that we can have compassion for each other and for ourselves over this instinct to deny what's uncomfortable. He says, inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised because attention to it mitigates against your happiness, contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience now is a grief-soaked proposition. If you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. And this book, or this video, this is actually an hour and 10-minute long documentary about Stephen Jenkinson called Grief Walker. Connie and I shared it with dozens of people. It's fabulous. And his book, Die Wise, is one of the wisest books we've ever read. Highly recommend. Stephen Jenkinson is a Canadian death worker, really coming from this sacred side of science and this deep ecological wisdom understanding. So, we struggle, we suffer, we self-destruct. Homo denial are us. And we have mismatched instincts, and we live in a world of supernormal allurements. See, our instincts aren't matched any longer to our conditions. They were selected by natural selection and served us just like every other animal's instincts, but now they're mismatched. And understanding that mismatch can go a long way towards helping us to understand and have compassion for ourselves and each other in the challenges that we face in living in a modern, postmodern world. Deirdre Barrett wrote a book called Supernormal Stimuli: How Primal Urges Overran Their Evolutionary Purpose. Because in case it's not obvious, this isn't food. This is a food-like item that we are evolutionarily programmed to want and to want more of. You'll find nothing like this in the natural world. Deirdre Barrett says almost everyone will overeat if dining on supernormal stimuli. They've taken birds' eggs, and if you replace its normal egg with a ceramic egg or a wooden egg that's a little bit bigger, a little bit brighter, a little bit more pronounced, the bird will always sit on the fake egg. It'll ignore its own eggs, and it does this. It never learns. It continues to do this. It's a supernormal stimuli. Bees will become addicted to cocaine. Roundworms will become addicted to nicotine. Deirdre Barrett writes, the most dangerous aspect of our modern diet arises from our ability to refine food. This is the link to drug, alcohol, and tobacco addictions. Coca doesn't give South American Indians health problems when they brew or chew it. No one's ruined his life eating poppy seeds. When grapes and grains were fermented lightly and occasionally, they presented a healthy pleasure, not a hazard. Salt, fat, sugar, and starch are not harmful in their natural contexts. It's our modern ability to concentrate things like cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and food components that turns them into a menace that our bodies are hardwired to crave. So the good news here is that we can honor reality. We can honor what's inescapably real. For example, we all have cravings for sugar, salts, and fats. Why is that? Well, it's because for 99% of human history, it wasn't easy to find sugar, salts, and fats. So having a craving for those things allowed our ancestors to survive long enough to reproduce. Yet today we're bombarded with foods that have sugar, salts, and fats. Yet we still have the cravings as though they were rare. It's a mismatch. Every one of us is alive today because some of our ancestors survived famine. That is, they were really good at storing energy as fat. That's what fat is. Fat is stored energy. So we store energy as fat, and that's what's allowed us to survive the droughts, the harsh times, the lean times, the harsh winters. And then testosterone. Turns out that one of the things we know about testosterone, we don't believe this, we know this, is that the higher the testosterone in men and women, the more people think about sex. In fact, you can put testosterone patches. There was a couple that we stayed with, 12 years ago now. And she said that her doctor had put her on testosterone patches. And she said within less than a week, she said, I couldn't stop thinking about sex. She said, is this what guys have to deal with? Well, yes, the answer is yes. And it turns out that men typically have 10 to 20 times the testosterone that women do. By the way, this is an image of a rock. So somebody sent us this series of cartoons, or not cartoons, these three images. And here's a real adolescent moose and a statue of a buffalo. And here we have typical adolescent male behavior. Now, the person who sent me this in an email said, is this statutory rape or is this merely a misdemeanor? I know, pretty bad. But nonetheless, it's pretty funny because then about 4 years later, we were actually in Big Sky, Montana, and somebody took us by. They actually lived in the same neighborhood as this buffalo. That was pretty cool. So our instincts deceive us for very good evolutionary reasons. Snakes don't talk. And think about many of the issues that we and our kids and our grandkids have struggled with or do struggle with. Addictions of all kinds, scandals of all kinds, conflicts. And it's not just our personal issues. So many of our collective problems have an inadequate understanding of human nature at their root, at their foundation, or this mismatched instincts in a world of supernormal stimuli. I mean, think about it. What was there to be addicted to 10,000 years ago? Were you going to run into some fermented berries? I mean, hard liquor wasn't even invented until 300 or 400 years ago. And yet now we've got all of these things, video games, shopping, internet porn, romance novels, drugs and alcohol, tobacco, social networking sites, all of this stuff that our ancestors never were exposed to. This came out about 6 years ago. Cover story in Newsweek magazine, I Crazy, Panic, Depression, Psychosis, How Connectivity Addiction is Rewiring Our Brains. So I want to introduce the parable of the pickle jar. Connie Barlow, my wife's niece, Halsey Barlow, she's now in her young 30s, but when she was 18, she read Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal, Why We Are the Way We Are, The New Science of Evolutionary Psychology, which even now, 15 years after it was written, is still one of the best books ever written on evolutionary psychology. And she sent us this email. She said, I now put everything into an evolutionary context. It's almost become a reaction that when I encounter a situation, I think, okay, why am I feeling this way? How and why would my 780th great-grandmother react to this? It doesn't even have to be anything significant. For instance, if I see one of my roommates snacking on my jar of pickles, I get this feeling in my stomach like, hey, back off, those are mine, mine, mine. I want to be laid back and not care, but my instincts are so darn uptight. But knowing that I'm a selfish, status-seeking hornball only motivates me to do things that say, F you to my evolutionary roots, even though I really do love them. I absolutely love how imperfect and clumsy we are as humans. I mean, almost any situation can be laughed off if we only step back and take a look at why we feel the way that we do. I love it. I wouldn't want it any other way. Now, is that amazing for an 18-year-old? This perspective untrivializes or realizes ancient mythic wisdom, ancient mythic insights, such as the fall and original sin. For example, prior to microscopes, before we even could see bacteria, before we had any understanding of bacteria, it wasn't just difficult to understand infection. It was totally impossible to understand infection. Well, prior to large-scale telescopes, it wasn't just difficult to understand the large-scale structure of the universe, it was completely impossible. Well, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, it wasn't just difficult to understand our evolved nature, our brains, it was impossible. And yet there were mythic interpretations, there were mythic insights or intuitions. For example, the Apostle Paul, I love this quote. He says, I am a slave to sin. I really don't understand myself. I have the desire to do what is good, but I don't do it. What I end up doing is not the good that I want to do, but what I hate to do. What a wretched man am I. I believe that history will show that the greatest psychological and spiritual revelation or realization of the 20th century was the discovery that human beings have powerful, indeed compelling instincts, just like all other animals do. And that if we don't humble ourselves before primary reality, the living God, prioritize the future, and respect, that is, honor and harness our inherited drives, we are bound to be enslaved to them. There are profound emotional and practical benefits from this perspective. For example, we can have gratitude for what we've inherited. We can move beyond denial, guilt, and resentment. I had a man who was 82 years old in Florida come up to me, and he was practically moved to tears by my program. And he said, I've got to tell you, he took me aside, and he said, I've got to tell you what happened to me. 30 years ago, he said, I had an affair. He said, I actually had 5 affairs, because what happened was I got promoted. And what we know is that when somebody, especially men, get promoted or when they have a rise in status, their testosterone levels skyrocket. And women in their presence, their testosterone levels skyrocket. And so he said, I got promoted. I had never betrayed my wife. I've been married 13 years. He said, and then within 6 months of my promotion, he said, I had 5 affairs. None of them knew about each other. My wife didn't know about any of them. He said, it ultimately cost me my marriage. It cost me my job. And he said, I've been living with the guilt and the shame of this for the last 30 years. He said, your program released that for me. And I talked to him, that was Sunday. I talked to him several days later. Turns out he called his ex-wife. He apologized. He was in tears. He was freed. In fact, when the New York Times Magazine did a feature article on my book, Thank God for Evolution, they interviewed him. We can have compassion for ourselves and others. Healing broken relationships becomes much easier. We stayed with a woman who's a neurobiologist, and she said, isn't it amazing, speaking about compassion, she said, isn't it amazing that science is giving us access to this traditional spiritual virtue? We can develop a witness capacity, not like a witness just sitting on a cushion, but an evolutionary witness. So again, this is a beta version of this program. I welcome any and all suggestions for improvement. Here's my contact information and websites.